retired military veteran who served in the U.S. Marines as well as in the U.S. Army, and part of that time included service as a military police lieutenant and a military police captain, as well as a JAG officer. And I guess likely the discussion that we're having today, as many of my brothers and sisters in arms have all spent a large proportion of their lives defending American ideals and notions of equality, and they continue to be in the field today doing so. Nonetheless, these are very complicated times. Our nation's perennial allegiance to the idea that police officers are national heroes appeals so strongly to the personal ethos of American culture that today virtually every U.S. president honors police officers. Political candidates compete for their endorsements. Public officials and media portray them as our most courageous citizens. And for decades, the conventional wisdom has been that police misuse of force and excessively violent police officers are not tolerated in the United States and pose no significant threat to public safety. Nonetheless, it cannot be reasonably denied that Dr. Martin Luther King, during the 1960s, in his renowned I Have a Dream speech, as well as his renowned letter from the Birmingham jail, spoke passionately about the festering sore of systemic police brutality and police killings of black men, women, and children amid widespread protests. And we today, more than some 50 years later, are here addressing the same issue. We must accept the fact that approval ratings for police officers today are continuing to plummet in the midst of growing concern that widespread racialized police violence in the United States and a growing concern that incidents involving George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Betty Jones, John Crawford, Khalil Castillo, Jake Breakup, and so many others are simply not isolated events and that they are not rare. And so today, more and more citizens of all colors, of all ages, of all orientations and ideologies are beginning to band together and express zero tolerance for police violence and the lack of accountability and effective legislation to address police violence. And so without question, today's young men and women are bravely defending their right and the right of Black Americans to live free from the threat of police violence and calling for robust improvements in the way legislatures, prosecutors, and courts respond to police violence and the indifference that sustains it. Now, of course, the notion that a significant number of our nation's Black citizens are victims of police violence and unreasonable stops conflicts with some of our most patriotic inclinations and strikes some Americans as preposterous. But the data reflects otherwise. Virtually 100% of every comprehensive study conducted by federal, state, and local agencies, as well as various task force and journalistic investigations, has concluded that Black Americans are disproportionately targeted and subjected to alarming levels of police violence undeservedly. Indeed, the studies conducted in our own state also reveal the same. But first, let's look at the national picture. Today, we've reached a point where police killings represent the sixth leading cause of death for Black men behind cancer, suicide, and other homicides, heart disease, and accidents. Of the 1,320 African Americans killed since 2015, according to the Washington Post, 96% of them were Black men. That's 1,272 compared to 48 Black women. We not only have a police violence problem, we have a racial problem, and I'll talk more about this. And within Illinois, I would turn this committee's attention to the work of the Police Accountability Task Force, which I quote found that Chicago Police Department, which is our largest police department in one of the largest cities in the United States, that their own data gave validity to a widely held belief amongst many Americans that police officers have no regard for the sanctity of life when it comes to people of color. And that's a quote. When they analyzed 404 shootings between 2008 and 2015, the findings were remarkably alarming. 74% of the people hit or killed by police officers were Black Americans, compared to 14% Hispanics and 8% whites, less than 1% Asians. Asians, excuse me. And for perspective, let's be clear, Chicago is evenly split by race, with whites comprising approximately 32%, blacks comprising approximately 33%, and Hispanics comprising virtually 29%. I would also add that oftentimes after being shot, the bodies of Black Americans are left on the ground, and police do not often attempt to even administer any aid or CPR, despite their training to do so. This is true even in the case of a child like Tamir Rice, who was found to be a child no more than 12 years old playing with a toy gun in an area where kids were known to be playing cops and robbers and whatever else they play in the park. And we cannot ignore the fact that while this child laid on the ground, his own sister was denied an opportunity to come to his aid, and police officers did nothing to help him. Meanwhile, we must look at that situation in comparison to the situation in Kenosha, where a Caucasian male walked around with a high-powered semi-automatic military-grade rifle, walked past numerous police officers, killed two pro-civil rights protesters, law-abiding protesters, and went home to sleep comfortably in his own bed. Also, with the Police Accountability Task Force, which was led by then President of Chicago Board of Police, Lori Lightfoot, and former Governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, they also found that with respect to tasers, Black Americans were disproportionately targeted. Of the 1,886 taser discharges between 2012 and 2015, Blacks are disproportionately targeted at a very high rate. 76%. That's 1,435 Black Americans tased by police officers, comparison to 13% Hispanics, 8% whites, and less than 1% for Asians, excuse me. Also, with respect to stops that did not lead to an arrest, meaning that these people were not engaged in any crimes, but nonetheless were stopped, okay, innocent people, the task force looked at 250 stops between 2011 and 2014. The results were equally alarming. 72% of the people that were stopped were Black Americans, compared to 17% for Hispanics, only 9% for whites, and 1% for Asian Americans. What's very alarming about these stops, the disproportionate stops of African Americans, is that the task force found that according to the Chicago Police Department's own data, okay, that Black Americans were 4 times likely to be stopped than whites. Yet, whites were twice as likely, either in their cars or when stopped, twice as likely to be carrying contraband. So again, police officers knew that they were finding more illegal conduct when they stopped white Americans, yet continued to stop Black and Hispanic Americans at 4 times the rate that they were stopping white Americans. What does this mean? This means that we've reached a point in the United States where police officers are not engaged in law enforcement, but rather enforcing a certain racial hierarchy where whites sit at the top and blacks sit at the very bottom, and that Black Americans have no rights, that many police officers, or too many police officers, feel that they are entitled to respect. Hence, we have a racism problem with respect to the use of force. We do not have a training deficiency problem, in my view. We might look at police shootings in Los Angeles, which are at a 30-year low. How is that? It did not become as a result of training. It came as a result of increased policies that compelled police to de-escalate certain situations, as well as monitoring police conduct very seriously and civilian oversight. I would also point to the work of the Camden Police Department, who also conducted a complete overhaul of their police department and have attained very remarkable results. I would also point this committee's attention to a 2015 survey of 1,200 Chicago residents of all ages, but at least 16 and older, which found remarkable racial disparities, where Black males reported, 70% of Black males reported that they were stopped by police and that the police behaved very aggressively. Now, I understand that there are many people who feel as though that despite the data, police officers are only trying to keep our neighborhoods safe. But again, I will point to the fact that the data reflected that it was not Black and Hispanics that were found to be violating the law any more than whites. And we certainly know with respect to drug crimes, there is no data that suggests that Black Americans or Hispanic Americans take drugs any more than white Americans. I would also point to FBI reports that indicate that Black Americans do not pose a significant threat to law enforcement officers. In fact, the FBI reports that of the 511 law enforcement officers killed between 2004 and 2013, it was white citizens responsible for killing the majority of those officers. Yet, we have to keep in mind that the loss of any law enforcement officer is too much. In 2018, the FBI reported that 55 officers were feloniously killed and 51 died accidentally. So I do not take lightly that the loss of any law enforcement officer is a major problem. Nonetheless, we must consider that since 2015, nearly 6,000 Americans have been killed. So, in light of the things that the data reflects, I want to say that I share the concerns of my fellow panelists. I reiterate one of the things that my fellow panelists said, that I agree that deadly force must be used as a last resort and only when necessary to prevent imminent death and seriously bodily harm. I also agree that there must be a duty to attempt to de-escalate as well as a duty to intervene and report. Too many police officers are sitting by idly watching other police officers violate the law. There must be a mandatory reporting system, and I am asking this committee to call for the immediate establishment of a 24-hour hotline that allows police officers to report unanimously any perceived misuse or violation of use of force guidelines in the state of Illinois. Too many police officers will not report misuse of force or violation on the law of their fellow police officers because of police culture or a phenomenon known as the blue wall of silence. We have to address that issue. A 24-hour anonymous hotline would do just that. We've had remarkable success curtailing many strands of misconduct within the civilian community as a result of a 24-hour hotline, and there's no reason why we cannot do that with respect to policing. I would also agree that this committee should consider that no police officer should use force or be allowed to use force that will cause incidental loss of life to civilians. We must consider incidents like that occurred involving the death of Betty Jones. No police officer should be able to use excessive force in relation to the use force in relation to the concrete or direct concrete and direct advantage anticipated by an arrest outweighs the use of force. That is, police officers should not use this deadly force when that deadly force or that force is disproportionate to the suspected or alleged crime the person committed. We simply cannot walk around killing unarmed people simply because they did not move fast enough or they believed they had stolen a candy bar from the store or they are walking away. Deadly force must be used as a last resort. I would also add that police officers must take into account the alarming number of people with special needs, people with disabilities who are killed by police. The data reflects that too many people who cannot hear police and follow their command are being killed. The data reflects that there are too many people who cannot move fast enough because of physical disabilities, or they lack the emotional, intellectual development to understand what the police officer is saying. And too many of our disabled and citizens with special needs are losing their lives simply because they lack the ability to comply with the officer's commands and they simply do not understand. It is not a proper grounds to kill an unarmed American simply because they are not moving fast enough or because they can't get to the ground fast enough or because they can't raise their arm fast enough. That does not constitute a threat. I would also say, in closing, that police must be warned against biases and inclinations to perceiving people as threats on the basis of race and/or gender, and must be subject to state licensing requirements. I've listened to all of the testimony for about 2 hours, And frankly, while I was appreciative of the very hard work that our men and women in uniform are doing with respect to training, it was very discouraging. There was no data reflecting that the decertification procedures are actually working. In fact, I don't know that we heard anything with respect to the number of people who have been decertified in the last several years, despite widespread indications that we simply have too many bad police officers serving in the police department. We must take into account the federal guidelines, federal warnings that too many white supremacists and white nationalists are serving in our police forces all around the country and represent a very clear threat to public safety. In fact, federal testimony within the last several months indicates that the threat of white supremacy in the United States has surpassed the threat posed by foreign terrorist organizations. In short, and in closing, I want to say that we have a racial discrimination problem rather than a training deficiency problem. As an example, too many police officers, according to the data, according to judges, according to police chiefs, according to various academic findings, are lying on their police reports and also when they're testifying. If you are a person that needs to be trained to tell the truth, you are not qualified to be a police officer. Also, with respect to the guardian mentality versus the warrior mentality, let's be clear. The guardian mentality is alive and well with respect to white citizens. It is only typically the warrior mentality is what's applied to black citizens. There is no data that supports the contention that training without equal emphasis on accountability and removal of excessively violent police officers will work. We simply must do more. And I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. And again, like others, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you, sir.